Welcome back to the Conduct Detrimental Podcast. This is Dan Worley, joined by my co-host Dan Wallach. Dan, what's happening?
Oh, geez, that's a loaded question. A lot is happening. We're recording this on Thursday, December 1st, first day of December, less than 12 hours after word leaked out that the Major League Baseball Players Association and Major League Baseball have, resolved whatever difficulties and deal points that were separating them on a deal. And now we have a new CBA in baseball. So, which leads us really into the topic du jour.
Yeah,
right?
We are talking about the NBA CBA today, but I think it's a good starting point to just mention the MLB CBA. And really what I took away from that agreement was they didn't change that much. They did some tweaking, but the big hitting issues such as the international draft and a few other things ended up not happening. And so I think that to me that reflects sort of where the teams and the players are as far as this is a really profitable league. Things are going well on the business side. Why mess that up? And I think a lot of those themes are going to follow through on the NBA side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I took a look. My quick take on the MLB deal is that what shocked me more than anything. I mean, it's great that there's no international draft, but I don't know if salaries are going to grow that much. The luxury tax threshold is only going to go up incrementally over the course of the next 5 years. I think it's capped or at the end of the 5-year period, it's probably going to grow no greater than 15 or 20 million over it is today, and I'm not sure that that's keeping pace with the influx of revenues coming into Major League Baseball. I don't think it's such a fantastic deal for the players. It's just it's just basically status quo. We'll keep the existing system in place with some minor tweaks, but I'm not sure it was such a great thing for the players. Not quite convinced their union boss Tony Clark did a good enough job in creating room for salary growth.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and obviously luxury tax is just sort of there's no salary cap in baseball, the only sport that doesn't have one. So the luxury tax sort of artificially acts as sort of a soft cap, preventing teams from hitting it. Mm-hmm. But I think it'll be interesting to see how many teams end up exceeding that cap and whether or not they're impeded by a luxury tax. Because we've seen teams in the past, such as the Dodgers, then the NBA, as we're about to talk about, has a luxury tax as well, and we've seen teams just disregard that in big markets. So, yeah, whether or not that makes a difference, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, for the small market teams, it does.
Well, there's a new poison pill in the deal, where if you're a super exceeder of the luxury tax and hit a $250 million or $260 million threshold, the percentage penalty that a luxury tax violator will now have to pay, and I think that threshold is aimed at the Yankees and the Dodgers. Those teams could be in a position to pay a penalty of anywhere 50% or 60%. And while that's not a big deal today, in 2018, some of the most iconic players are going to become free agents. Mario Machado. A couple of players from the Nationals. So while those big deals, the $40 million per year annual player contract threshold may not be hit this year or next year, in 2018, I think that luxury tax threshold aimed at the Dodgers and the Yankees is really going to, inhibit the ability of the Yankees and Dodgers to go after that bounty free agent class, and is obviously designed to prevent super teams from forming unless you're willing to pay, almost double your salary, your annual salary cost as a penalty. And as desirous as the Yankees are of putting together a team with Drew Bryce and Machado, the prospect of paying a $400 or $500 million, total, bill to have a super team, I don't think the Yankees are going to go there. So the big issue to me, besides the very incremental increases in the threshold, are the penalties aimed at the Dodgers and Yankees should they eclipse the $250 million mark, and both teams are pointed in that direction to try to do that.
It's a good point. And bringing again back to the NBA, I think a lot of the themes that we'll talk about are sort of the blocking of super teams. And there was talk that it was going to be a lot more focused on that point moving into negotiations, and I think they didn't quite get there, but there's certainly elements of that we'll try to touch on in a few minutes. There's two details of the MLB CBA that leaked out this morning that I just thought were interesting and worth noting. First, the All-Star home field advantage for World Series rule was abolished, which I personally agree with. I thought that was kind of foolish. The All-Star game's an exhibition. It's tough to penalize a team like the Cubs this year, who had the best record in baseball, and only give them 3 home games during the World Series, which ultimately didn't end up costing them. But, if the Cubs had lost the World Series, I think there may have been a big public outcry against that rule. And then the second rule that I thought was interesting was they abolished smokeless tobacco for new MLB players. So the existing MLB players are grandfathered in, which is an interesting sports law issue because we've seen a number of municipalities across baseball where stadiums are ban the use of smokeless tobacco, including at stadiums. So places like San Francisco, I think Chicago has one now, other places as well, have banned that. I haven't followed closely enough. I haven't seen it be an issue of enforcement or not, which we thought we may have seen during this past year. But I think it's the continued emphasis on that point moving forward is one to note.
Yeah, it's banned in my law firm as well. It would seem to me that the goal of a policy like this is to have a channeling effect down through the minor leagues in college baseball. The days of, the TV cameras panning the dugout and seeing players spit out, they're chewing tobacco. I think those days are going to come to an end fairly soon. And as we turn over into a new generation of up-and-coming players, smokeless tobacco and spitting out tobacco in the dugout, I think that's in another 10, 15 years, probably won't see that anymore. And it's really not that controversial. The dangers associated with tobacco, Major League Baseball has been the last bastion of the permissiveness of tobacco use. And in every other quadrant of American society, public smoking in public areas is pretty much accepted as going away. So this will in turn channel behavior in the right direction, with baseball.
Yeah. So let's get on to today's topic, and that's obviously another CBA, the NBA CBA, and it's sort of next on the checklist of labor disputes that could happen. Although I think things are looking pretty positive right now. The existing agreement was signed in 2011, and it has an opt-out for this year. The deadline is December 15th, so 2 weeks from today. And either side can opt out. Both sides haven't definitively said that they will, but there's this understanding that one or both will come December 15th. However, talks, as I mentioned, are extremely positive, which has been a bit surprising. If you would have asked me 6 to 8 months ago whether I thought we'd be where we are today, I would say absolutely not. And I think probably the two main parties here, Michelle Roberts, the head of the NBAPA, and Adam Silver, the head of the NBA, who represents the owners, probably would have said the same thing, especially Michelle Roberts. She was probably saying that she was not very optimistic that the NBA would meet their demands. And so, we're at a point now where we're 2 weeks away. They've come and said, well, they plan on having a deal done during the week of December 5th. So that's next week. They plan to announce a finalized deal before the deadline. I mean, Dan, was this something that really shocked you? And why do you think it all kind of came together this way?
Well, it doesn't shock me anymore. It shocked me at the beginning because Michelle Roberts came into her position with a platform to, kind of roll back the gains that the owners had achieved. I mean, 5 years ago, the percentage of basketball-related income that was assigned to the players was 57%. And in the last 15 years in professional sports, we've seen the owners chipping away in hockey, NBA, NFL, baseball. basically rolling back all the gains that were achieved in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And she came into her office, into her position with a platform and a goal in mind, which is to, recover or gain back some of which was given away in 2011. So with the imminent announcement of this new deal, it begs the question, what have the players gained? And there are many reasons why the state of affairs is what it is. I mean, billionaires are always going to be able to crush any player revolt insofar as our federal labor laws really do prevent the federal courts from interfering with ongoing labor disputes by issuing injunctions. So if the players can't get an immediate injunction in court and are not economically positioned to take on the owners over the long haul, what leverage do they have?
Yeah, I would note that they had the 57% BRI. BRI means basketball-related income, basically any sort of income that the team receives from any sort of basketball activity, ticket sales, et cetera, et cetera. It was bumped down to basically a 50-50 split in 2011. So the players lost a good share of that. And I think that was the real issue going into this negotiation is, wow, the NBA teams are making a ton of money. You know, we've seen the Clippers sell for $2 billion. Owners are doing great. The players are saying, well, we need to get at least some of this back. And that hasn't happened. You know, so basically it's been announced that the BRI split's going to remain the same, although there are a few nuances to that, being that the BRI in itself is going to change how it's calculated, right? Because what goes into that, one of the big things is a TV deal, but there's also, other forms of media that are forming this BRI deal, and that sort of calculation of what percentage of these additional revenue streams is something that's been rumored to have been changed in this new deal. So while the split remains the same, they're splitting a bigger pie. So they're actually going to be getting more money out of it, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense when you calculate or when you consider all the new forms of media rights that are going to be available for sale. And of course, basketball is different than the other three major sports because it's a globally popular sport. Europe, China, the NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball don't have the same levels of popularity that the NBA has. So the argument for maintaining the status quo is, despite the percentages, the pie is growing significantly. The new cable deal, 9 years, $24 billion. So 50% of a pie that grows by 50% is when the dust settles, it's more meaningful than simply getting a couple of increased deal points on the split. And that's the owner's argument, and that's their leverage. And the players, who quite frankly have very limited shelf life of a playing career. The average playing career is, measured in a couple of years. And to sit out a season or to strike over, 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points, the economic incentive is not there considering what may be lost. And to shut down the league for a year, for 2 years, for the crapshoot of going into court on an antitrust suit, it's really, for lack of a better word, too big of a gamble when the pie is so enormous and player salaries have grown significantly since the last CBA.
Exactly. We saw the free agency boom this past offseason. I think it comes down to, why would the players, why would the teams want to risk messing up a good thing they have going? We saw the last time in 2011 the financial state of the league was not as good. Teams were claiming to have been losing money. The accounting of that determination is somewhat in question. The players disputed that the teams were actually losing money, whether or not they were taking into account the change in value of franchise, et cetera. Yeah. But now I think it's pretty undisputed that everyone's doing well. The game's growing internationally, as you mentioned. So why mess that up?
Well, there's no anger point or flashpoint issue around which the players can coalesce. I mean, we just saw in our U.S. presidential election there was, anger and desire for change in the country. Let's make America great again. Well, no one can dispute that the NBA is already great. The game is as healthy as it's ever been. So that issue around which the players can, foment all this anger and desire for change simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think going back to our point about 6 or 8 months ago, I think we could have made all these same points, but the reason that I still was at least skeptical was we had 2 new parties on both sides of the negotiation. So we have Michelle Roberts, who's a very well-known labor lawyer who, previously worked at the mega firm Skadden Arps in New York. And she came in swinging, as we mentioned, making all these promises about various aspects of the CBA. And so, we knew that she was going to be aggressive. And then on the other side of the table, we have Adam Silver, who has been working for the NBA for quite some time. He's also a lawyer, very thoughtful guy. Had experience, was known as sort of the guy doing most of the legwork in the 2011 CBA, but he wasn't the head of the deal. That was David Stern at the time, the commissioner at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we just didn't really know what his style would be either. So there was just so much unknown. And what we did know is Michelle Roberts' public comments saying, well, this isn't going to stand, this isn't going to stand. And then somewhere over these last 6 to 8 months, all of that has softened, or at least much of it has softened. And I think, getting back to our point, that's just probably a reflection of the financial status of the league. So I wanted to talk, we don't need to get into the nitty gritty of all of these proposed details. If you guys want to see that, I wrote an article from my website, The White Bronco, that lists basically every reported change. I think there's 19 reported changes to the NBA CBA that have been publicly leaked. And I kind of went through and analyzed all of those on my site, so you can check that out. But we wanted to kind of touch on a few of the predicted changes and a few things that have been reported and just things that were interesting to us. And so the first one that I saw that was kind of interesting, related to other sports too, was the shortened preseason schedule. And basically what that means is there are going to be less preseason games, the same amount of regular season games, but the regular season will stretch over a longer period of time. And that's interesting because it really, I think, boils down to a player safety issue. Not necessarily, the NBA doesn't have the concussion problem that the NFL does, but they still have player safety issues and player safety concerns. And so shortening the preseason will also reduce the total number of games that players play, but also give the players more rest during the regular season and probably eliminate the 4 games in 5 nights that players complain about all the time, and reduce the number of back-to-back games, which you see being an issue. So that was the NBA sort of addressing player safety in their own way, and I think we've heard proposals similar to this in the NFL. I think NFL players have complained about, I think they play 4 preseason games in the NFL. They just say that's way too many. It should be 2.
Yeah.
And that's a way to do it. And I think, maybe the NFL should do that. Shrink the preseason to 2 games. Have multiple bye weeks. Have a scenario which there's just been this talk this week about eliminating Thursday night football, and I think you don't need to eliminate it. You just need to make sure that a team doesn't play on Sunday and then on Thursday. So make sure that the bye week comes before that, and you'd be set, or you play on a Thursday, then another Thursday. So there's a full week at some point of rest there. And I think if you implemented this in the NFL and reduced the preseason schedule, you could make that all happen.
Yeah, I think the big winner with the shortened preseason aren't necessarily the players, the fans. If you have a season ticket package in the NFL or the NBA, I mean, they make you buy the home preseason games. You have no choice. I used to have season tickets to the Knicks, and I have to tell you, I've never, in all my years as being a Knicks season ticket holder, I never went to a preseason home game. So I think it's a fan-friendly policy in that you're going to be paying for the games that you want to attend, and are not being forced to pay a penalty and buy those extra 2 or 3 preseason games. I'm not so sure though that from the player's perspective it's going to be necessarily safer, because while you're going to span out the number of days between games during the regular season, those games are going to be replaced by practices, and practices, particularly particularly if you have someone like a Tom Thibodeau or someone who is known to be, kind of a taskmaster and runs a lot of hard practices. I think the absence of the games on back-to-back nights help, but it's not necessarily a respite for the players who will likely be practicing a lot more. So Allen Iverson, may not have been really happy about this change, but overall, I mean, it's hard to nitpick. It is a good thing because as a fan, and as a fan, having so many games spaced so close together is too much. And for the players, it is a question of fatigue and susceptibility to injury to have to go back to back 3 and 4, 4 and 6. Hopefully, those will disappear. And even if they're replaced by practices here and there, it's not quite the same thing as going full throttle for 48 minutes. Playing for keeps.
Yeah, I agree. And I think another issue a good thing to keep an eye on moving forward in the next couple of years is sort of the ramp-up period, too. Is the preseason really ramping up players to be ready for the regular season as is? And if we shorten that, is that going to leave them susceptible to injury come opening night? So I think that's something else to keep an eye on as far as player safety goes. I'm sure that the teams will probably add in more preseason practices as well to try to get their players ramped up, and hopefully with other sort of player safety technology advancements in the game, we continue to see less injuries and better teams deal with injuries better. I think it's another interesting point about this is it's similar to what we hear about the NFL frequently is that, and the NBA too, is them staying in the forefront of the national media for longer. So the season will actually last longer now. It's already a forever long season, but now it's probably going to start sometime in mid-October. And when does the NBA Finals end? In June, right? Does it go till July? I mean, like mid-June. So it's going to be a really long, and that's 8.5, 9 months long. The NBA is going to be playing games out of the year. So that's kind of wild to me.
But the season, I'm not sure that the end of the playoffs are going to be impacted by the spacing out of the regular season, because as a matter of necessity, basketball's got to stop at some point in June. It's never going to go into July. And there's the issue of dilution of the product if too much of it is thrust into the fans' faces with like back to back, and having a separation of more days off between games, I think will keep fan interest heightened. And I've always felt of all the preseasons. Of all the sports league preseasons, I've always believed that the NBA's was the most meaningless because these players come into camp in tip-top shape. Many play summer league basketball. I mean, when I lived in New York, I used to regularly see Ron Artest, Chris Mullin. I mean, these are names that some from the '90s might remember vividly. But most NBA players don't need the preseason to get in shape. Look at Derrick Rose. You and I have followed the Derrick Rose sexual assault civil trial very closely. He missed the entirety of the preseason and came into this year's season with the Knicks under a cloud, or an injury cloud, because he had so many years after 2011 when he couldn't play a full season. Well, guess what's happened now? Derrick Rose hasn't missed a single game. And while his effectiveness at the front end was not as acute as it is currently, he didn't miss a beat. And if you have fewer preseason games, I'm not sure that's going to impact the conditioning of the players or their cohesiveness as a 5-man or 12-man or 15-man or 16, 17-man unit. I think of all the sports, the NBA is probably the most ramped up and ready to go to start a season from the beginning of training camp. I don't think they need too long. From a coach's perspective, they would love to have like a 3-month preseason, but the reality is the quality of the game will not suffer by shortening the preseason.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think most players do come into camp in shape, and even those that don't, the current preseason isn't. If Eddie Curry comes into camp out of shape, I don't think he's going to be completely ready to go by the regular season opener anyway. So it's kind of an evolving target. Let's move on to another point, and that's, we talked about this in the last podcast just for a minute, but I think the increase in the D-League salaries. So currently D League players make between $19,000 and $26,000, and those salaries are going to be increased to somewhere between, I think it's $50,000 and $75,000, and that makes it from, D League players also get their living expenses paid for, and that salary only covers half of the year while the season's going on. But it's really a significant jump as far as making a decent living from those wages, and I think that calculation could have an impact on players from Europe coming back and playing in the NBA and not going overseas, as well as, which I think is the more interesting one, high school players potentially opting to not go to college for a year and instead playing in the D League. And so that'll be an interesting phenomenon to keep in mind going forward. Obviously, the NBA one-and-done rule is an NBA rule, not an NCAA rule, and you have to be 19 years old before you can declare for the draft and be 1 year out of high school. So these players can go to the D League. They wouldn't be eligible to be called up from the D League, but they can play there, develop. Arguably, it'll increase competition, and give them, a chance to be better prepared than if they went to a college. I mean, there's at least an argument there. I don't think we're at that point yet, but if the salaries increase and the competition increases and the coaching arguably increases, we may get there in the next couple of years. So do you think this is really a challenge to the college model, and do you think we'll see a lot of exodus of those players?
The answer is yes, and it's not the NBA or the Players Association's job to worry about what's best for college athletics or the college experience. They have a business to run, and the truth is players who go directly from the NCAA into the NBA with scant exceptions aren't ready to take on a full-time, starring role in the league. Most players are not quite ready, and the current developmental league, the D League, is not quite has not ascended into the true development league that will serve like a baseball minor league feeder into the NBA. Today the D League almost has a stigma to it. If you're playing in the D League, you're not considered a professional caliber player, and that perception needs to end. And what Major League Baseball has in their AAA, AA, Single A system, and Rookie League, and Winter League, and Cape Cod League, that creates a true development of younger athletes so that they can be prepared and ready to step in and assume a full-time role once they reach the major leagues. Basketball has never really enjoyed that feeder system. And it's been largely populated by those who aren't quite good enough to make the NBA, or those looking for a second chance at the NBA. And it is imperative that the league create a development system that can rival and be similar to what's utilized in baseball, especially in the National Hockey League with the junior hockey and minor league apparatus, and that doesn't exist for the NBA. So raising the salaries will give players or collegiate athletes and high school athletes a more realistic choice to maybe stay in the United States and further develop their game rather than go to Europe. And not that that's such a terrible thing for the NBA, but there's an opportunity here to create a development league that can act as a true feeder system. And raising the salaries is imperative, because when you raise the salaries to $50,000 or $75,000, it provides some level of protection from a lawsuit challenge, because the salaries are so low that maybe the D League could have been a potential target for one of those like fair labor and overtime type of lawsuits. But it also creates an incentive and an opportunity for the NBA to create new roster spots. To add a 16th and 17th position on each NBA roster that would be subject to a two-way contract. So if you send a player down to a D League, he's not going to be relegated from $1 million salary to a $25,000 salary. It's still a disparity, but it's somewhat more equitable than what currently exists, and it's going to create potentially 60 more jobs in the NBA. To add those two new roster spots, I think is a gain, and an important gain for the players.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think another huge aspect of the really the investment in the D League moving forward, and I think we're going to see the D League being a lot more showcased, and having these two NBA players that are essentially going to be playing on the D League all the time from these extra roster spots is going to make it more competitive. And I think that players playing in Europe, I think it's almost without exception, it's most players' goal and dream to play in the NBA. And when you go over to Europe, there's certainly leagues in Europe that are very high profile that NBA teams always pay attention to, but a lot of other leagues and teams, you kind of fall off the radar a little bit. And so I think being on the D-League with players in the NBA being close, being affiliated to a new team, is going to give these players a chance to showcase their talents and for all the NBA teams to see, hopefully, at least moving forward. And that'll be really appealing to the players when they're sort of balancing, college, D-League, or Europe. But even with this increased salary, I think for the really blue-chip players that we've seen take a similar route of go from high school to Europe and then get drafted, such as Emmanuel Mudiay, I think he made $1.2 million playing in China for 1 year. So, the salaries in Europe and overseas are still, for the really good players, still much, much more. So we'll see if those type of deals continue to happen or not, and where we go from there.
Yeah, the international, pro leagues also present a different kind of problem. The salaries are higher, for sure. The playing experience is more comparable to a true professional experience. So the players that come back from Europe, whether they're Mudiay, Porzingis, Brandon Jennings, they're much more ready to step in. But at the same time, despite the higher salaries, despite the better professional experience, these buyout clauses are act as a disincentive for NBA teams to poach players in Europe, and they become it becomes a matter of duress and an economic pressure point for players to buy their way out of contracts without assistance from the NBA teams. There are a number of top professional players in Europe. Ricky Rubio is a perfect example. We saw this a couple of years ago. What delayed his transfer into the National Basketball Association, and he was drafted by the Timberwolves back in 2010. Took him a few years to come over because of the buyout provision, the onerous buyout provision, which required the player to pay a multi-million-dollar exit fee in order to leave his European team and come over to the NBA. And under the current system, the NBA teams can only fund a very small percentage of that buyout, which means basically the player has to buy his way out on his own dime and come over to the U.S. at a reduced, minimum or rookie scale salary. And I was looking for that to change in the new CBA. Have you heard anything about that inequity being dealt with?
I haven't, and I don't know if that's one of those issues that just doesn't get a lot of headlines, because it only comes up every few years when there's the Ricky Rubio, the Niko Mirotic out there, who's sort of handicapped by that problem. But it certainly could be something that we just haven't heard about. The information we're getting is from basically NBA reporters who have connections with the league. They're leaking information, so it's something to keep an eye on, I think, when the agreement does come out.
Well, that's been my pet issue for several years. I basically ran up to David Stern at a conference a couple of years ago. No, I asked him a question during Q&A. I said, "This is so unfair, Commissioner Stern. This is a terrible thing that's bad for the league, bad for players. How could you even allow it?" And his answer to me flippantly said, "Well, the teams in Europe have to make some money too." And I think he was just having some fun with me, but the real problem is the European players don't really have representation at the bargaining table. Yeah, there's the Players Association, and you have Paul and LeBron James and some of the superstars in the NBA, but I don't see any European presence at the bargaining table, and that is an issue that is more acute for a European trained and born player who wants to play in the NBA, but as a matter of economics and the disparity and the onerous contractual provisions that are imposed on him by his European club, can't afford to make the break and come to the NBA unless he's willing to basically work for free or for a low wage the first year or two of his contract.
Yeah, I think that all reflects sort of a theme of collective bargaining negotiations of it really, you have to focus on who the powerful parties are and who's the ones negotiating. And so we've seen in the past, we've seen basically incoming players, so college players or whatever it may be, get screwed because they're now stuck on these rookie scale contracts, which artificially deflate their salaries. And that's because they don't have a seat at the bargaining table. If there's a pie and the veterans in the league are the ones who's at the negotiating table can say, well, let's only give the rookies this small sliver of a pie. Let's make them earn it, even though we didn't have to earn it. They're going to want to do that because that leaves more pie for the rest of the players. So, that was something that we saw change in the last NFL agreement that and is currently part of the NBA agreement as well. It's been in the NBA for a while now, but obviously Karl Towns is making much less than he should be making, but you can say that with a lot of players. And one of the interesting aspects of this negotiation, one of the big headline, which I don't think many thought would actually happen, but headline issues going into it was the max contracts and whether the NBA would keep max contracts. Because, obviously LeBron James makes $30 million a year or whatever exactly it is, but he's worth much more than that to a team. Yeah. And so we're capping him at a certain point. And, he had come out and said that he didn't believe in that, and a few other superstars did too. And, they're the ones that are, the head of the NBA PA's player division aspect. And, but that's something that we're not going to see change. I think we're going to see the max players, it's been reported, have the ability to make a little bit more money. We saw, I think the max contract now, if you're a player with 7 to 8 years experience and you get a 5-year deal from your own team, you can hit $2 million in a contract. So you couldn't do that under the last CBA. So we're going to see a slight increase in max contracts, but not the whole abolishment of the cap.
Dan, should it be tied to a percentage of the cap on for a particular team, or is it going to be a flat, ceiling on the maximum salary? Because a player like LeBron James, if he were to be an unrestricted free agent and not subject to a hard, maximum, threshold for salary, I think a team would be willing to assign 35 to 40% of its overall cap space to have a player like LeBron James.
Yeah, I would argue more than that. I mean, if there was no cap and there was no max contract, I bet he could get $100 million a year.
But should the maximum salary be tied to a percentage rather than a baseline, a fixed number?
Well, it is tied to a percentage, I believe, and it's tied to a percentage based on your years of experience in the league.
Okay.
But that percentage is based on is then calculated into the cap, so it's kind of like a fixed number at the same time. So you can just calculate that out for the percentages of what the number is based on the percentage, which makes some sense.
Yeah, the shoe deals and the endorsement deals make that less of a critical deal point for the superstars in the NBA because the great players can exceed their basketball income with off the court income, and many do. So if you're LeBron James and your salary is $30 million annually and you can eclipse that with off the court endorsement income, if you're sitting with your annual income in the neighborhood of $60 million annually and up, you're not going to strike over that.
Well, he's still arguably losing out on $30 million. But I think the issue with striking is there's only so many players in the league that would command more than the max. And so when you're ultimately looking at a union and you have to represent all the members of the union, is that going to be the biggest issue to the majority of the union? The answer is no.
Definitely not.
But then again, who has the strongest voice in the room? Is LeBron able to convince these other players that it's unfair? When arguably, if the other players, if he's getting a bigger piece of the pie, they're getting less. So it's almost in their disinterest to have that rule change too.
I mean, to LeBron's credit, he's taking a lead at the bargaining table, but he seems to be advocating the interests of the greater good of the players' union rather than advancing his own interests. When you see the superstars sitting at the bargaining table and they're trying to benefit their brethren rather than to self-deal, I think it says a lot about the character of James and Chris Paul, and they're trying to take a real leadership role to benefit all of the players, not just some of the players. For me, the greatest inequity in player salaries has never been the cap on the top salaries. It's been the floor. It's been players who have been in the league 10 years or more that basically have to round out NBA rosters and are only getting a veteran's minimum salary of, $1.35 million. And then the mid-level exceptions have always seemed artificially low to me. If you're a taxpayer, an NBA taxpayer as a team, the most you can offer for a mid-level is somewhere in the $3 million range. And if you're under the threshold, the most you can offer as a mid-level exception is 5 some odd million. And I think the veteran minimums and the mid-level exceptions need to spike up. I think that's where the greatest opportunity is for rectifying an unfair system lies.
Yeah, and that's something that they have announced that they're going to do, and I think that those exception levels aren't tied to a percentage of the cap like we were talking about before. So when we saw this huge cap increase this past couple of years, those exceptions have stayed artificially low. So they reflect a smaller percentage than they would have under the previous lower salary caps. And so I think that was a big point going into these negotiations is we need to raise those. I don't know if they're going to now tie them to a percentage of the cap. Personally, I think that makes the most sense because then it'll grow with the cap as it grows or shrinks. Who knows? But rather than just assigning them a pure number. But I think that's something that they focused on and we're looking to change in this cap.
Okay. Are there going to be any new critical revenue streams that are captured in basketball-related income that did not exist previously? Because I think so much of the projected growth of the salary cap is tied into, anticipated increase in TV revenues and stuff that was already part of BRI basically getting larger. Is there any new revenue stream that was not captured or that is not captured in the current CBA that will now comprise basketball-related income? Because as TV revenues go up, they could always come down. Is there anything else to counterweight that we haven't seen previously?
So I think the answer is yes. What happened was when Michelle Roberts' team was implemented, they did a really thorough look at the CBA and look at the income that was coming in from various sources and found that the previous administration under Billy Hunter had missed a few things. At least this is reported. And so they found a few extra revenue streams that should have been included. So they're going to include those into the new agreement. And then we talked a little bit earlier about the possibility of new media streams, new technology making its way into it. And, I think those sources are somewhat unknown at this point, but we see a changing television landscape. Obviously, they got a massive TV deal. But even so, I think, the TV market, traditional TV market shrinking. I think I saw a report that ESPN lost over 500,000 subscribers last month. So these subscribers are going, arguably still going to get the content from somewhere. It just needs to figure out where that additional revenue is coming from. So I think those will be included as well. And then I have a question for you, Dan. I mean, as the sports betting guru, although not legal yet, that's an additional stream of revenue. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I'll make a prediction here. The CBA that is about to be announced will have a 5-year duration. Before those 5 years are up, sports betting, legal sports betting will be expanded beyond the state of Nevada, potentially into a number of other states. That will happen either because of a court decision, because of states like New Jersey or potentially Mississippi successfully overturning the federal law banning states from legalizing sports betting, or Congress will address the situation and open it up. So when sports betting becomes legal, you're talking about a market that approximates somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 billion, an illegal market mainly of close to $200 billion in wagers on professional sporting events. If you can legalize, regulate sports betting, what we're likely to see happen is the leagues will get a piece of that. The leagues will always benefit from sports betting insofar as, fan interest will be enhanced. The TV contracts will be worth more. They'll sell signage and sponsorships and sell video rights and data rights. All that stuff will certainly grow the pie. But one potentially astronomical part of the new sports betting pie will be the leagues receiving a small percentage of the betting handle of all bets that are associated with their games. And a number that was floated a couple of years ago by a New Jersey assemblyman, and he just threw out the number, but it makes sense. A quarter of a point, 0.25%. And if you view the overall sports betting handle in the United States as close to $200 million or $250 million, $250 million, a quarter of a point would be $1 billion. And I'm using, basically, round numbers and assuming that all leagues are created equal. But that kind of a revenue stream or that kind of a percentage tied to the betting handle going into the league's pocket could benefit the leagues, in particular the NBA, to the tune of several $100 million annually, which will filter down to the teams, raise the salary cap, and also benefit player salaries. The question is, will all these revenue streams associated with sports betting find their way into BRI? And under my reading of the current collective bargaining agreement, I think that they do. I think that they do fit within BRI, but it's not spelled out. And one of the questions that, at least in my mind, emerges is, are the players' union representatives and the NBA talking about how to treat sports betting related revenue in the future CBA? Because this could lead to a fight down the road if it's not adequately dealt with and specified as line items in the BRI, because that is going to be a major source of revenue to the NBA, much like a cable TV deal.
That's interesting. It'll be something I'm definitely going to look out for right away, because yeah, I mean, you throw $1 billion into that pot, and the owners are saying, "Well, no, that's all our money." I could see the players not loving that assessment.
Dan, the problem is education. The owners are well aware of the emergence or the likely emergence of sports betting on the landscape. But when I talk to players' unions representatives, I go to all these conferences where folks like D. Smith are there, and I went to the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in 2015, and a few people from the NBA, the newly installed officers of the NBA Players Union were there, and they had no idea that this was coming down the pike. I mean, they are focused solely on labor issues and not taking a look 5 years ahead at what's happening in the landscape necessarily. So I think to some degree, the management has a knowledge advantage over union officials in thinking about sports betting, and if it's left out of the CBA or not made specific enough, that's going to be on the players' union, because if you open up, if you read ESPN or follow the news in the sports gambling world, there are articles and reporting on the emergence or inevitability of sports betting in the United States becoming legal. So it needs to be addressed, and if it is addressed, that's one more huge way that the BRI pie will grow significantly. So even keeping the percentage allocated to the players at between 49 and 51%, you add in 100 or so million per year in revenues associated with sports betting. That will be one of the greatest economic stimulants for the league and for the players to come along since these big cable deals.
I have a question for you. I don't even know if you'll have an answer or not, but it seems to me...
I always have an answer. I'm not always right, but I will definitely have an answer to it. I promise you that.
So it seems to me like this is a massive market, right? You said 200 to 250 billion. It's estimated. Obviously, that's an estimate because they can't keep track of all the illegal betting, but it seems to me that number would grow even higher with legalized betting. Like, personally, I don't have a bookie. I'm not going to go find one to make bets. When I go to Las Vegas, maybe I'll place a bet or two. But I think, having the ability to legally do it, and, now there's sports betting apps where you can do it very easily, I may be more inclined to make a bet or two. I think there's a lot of people like that out there. I mean, has there been any predictions or any models done that show even a much larger increase in this revenue pot when it actually is legalized?
Projected growth? No, none that I'm aware of. The numbers that have been reported, or the estimates reported by outlets such as Gambling Compliance and the American Gaming Association's own projections of the current landscape are in the 140 to $200 billion range. I've not seen a projection of what the numbers will look like after sports betting becomes legal. And where the big number is going to come in is not the existing bettors betting legally, but as you point out, fans, those who are not currently betting with bookies or offshore sports books, now becoming able, from the comfort of their own homes or the comfort of their local racetrack or casino, to lay a bet on an NBA or an NFL games. But the real catalyst, I think, is going to be in-game, in-play wagering, which will take place inside arenas. Initially, when sports betting becomes legal, I think it's going to be more geared to brick and mortar facilities, and that racetracks, casinos, and venues licensed by states will conduct the activity as a way to boost their economic situations and bolster their profitability and bring tourism into the state. But over time, the activity, I think, will migrate more online. And I know Mark Cuban and Adam Silver have both spoken of their vision of seeing fans making, in-play prop bets from their smartphones, from their tablets, inside the buildings while they're watching the games. And that has the ability to take off and create an untapped market that will blow through $200 billion within a couple of years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting product. And you and I, when we were in Las Vegas a month or two ago, we did a tour of the William Hill's facility. William Hill's the biggest sports gambling
that was great.
company in the U.S., and one of the biggest internationally too. Might be the biggest, I'm not sure, but they have a separate room set up for this in-game betting, and they had we went during the Major League Baseball playoffs, so they had a game going, and they had panels up, and we had guys changing the odds pitch by pitch. And so a pitch would go, and the lines would close for a couple seconds. They would adjust the odds. It would go back up. You could bet before the next pitch whether he's going to get a hit, what bet on the game, anything you wanted to do at that point. And go on to the next pitch. It would just happen again and again. And I could just imagine either sitting in a stadium, in an arena doing it, or even just at a bar with your friends and just doing it, small stakes, betting, pitch to pitch. Oh, I think this guy's going to get a hit now, or this is going to be a stop or a three-pointer or whatever it may be. Like, that is just a totally different level of gambling that we haven't seen and haven't been able to accomplish on the existing market right now.
Yeah, that brings with it a whole set of different problems, however. I mean, the distraction at games and home court, home field advantage, when 20,000 people are focused on a betting opportunity and not rooting for their home team, that creates a different issue. And over time, the leagues are going to have to figure out how to balance creating a full, well-rounded game experience for their fans with understanding and preserving what makes the games great. And what makes the games great is the product on the field and the collective experience of rooting for your team and being fully engaged in what's taking place on the court. So I worry over time what this will do to the attention span of those who attend the games. But this is going to happen, and one of the real shortfalls of the current fantasy sports environment is I think one of the benefits is that it is shown the sports leagues a path to legalize sports betting. It has created this enormous amount of fan engagement, and it has been basically a sports betting pilot program for the professional sports leagues. And ultimately, I think it's going to pave the way for a comfort level that the leagues would have with a real full-on sports gambling environment. And I see this day as, the in-play stuff and the phones and the apps inside the arenas. I see that as being between 5 to 10 years away. It's not that far down the road. So if the current CBA doesn't capture that, that's certainly going to be a big deal point in the next CBA. And everybody benefits here. The leagues will certainly attract much more interest around the country. Ratings will go higher, but more importantly, this is a way for the players to have 51% or 50% of a much bigger pie. And I'm looking forward to that day happening. But this is just another example of why the NBA has less of a labor issue, because the potential for the game to grow is unlimited. All right, the new TV deal, the potential for sports betting, the worldwide popularity of the league. 50% of a growing pie is much better than having a higher percentage of a flat pie. So these are all good down the road possibilities for all involved, and the players are not losing here. Even though I don't see this deal as being a significant win for the players on any respect, other than maybe raising the floor of certain salary thresholds.
Yeah, I think there's like we saw with MLB, I think most of this is just minor tweaks. It's still surprising to me that the BRI split didn't even change by a point or two, but it's probably more important for them to get the deal done. But anyway, running out of time here, I want to move on to kind of talking about some scenarios. We mentioned that it's almost a certainty that this thing gets done, but you never know. These things can fall apart at any point. There could be a contentious issue that they think they have figured out and they really aren't seeing eye to eye. I mean,
let's hope so.
Yeah, for the enjoyment of it for us, I guess.
No, more articles to write, more blog posts, more tweets, more episodes. When everything is harmonious in sports, when everybody behaves, when everyone agrees,
no fun.
It's like nothing for us to do.
Right. Yeah, honestly, this I kind of planning out my year. I run a sports legal blog, and planning out my year and looking at various big cases and topics. I thought this was going to be something that was going to take up a ton of my time this time of year, because I just didn't see it happening. But it was so smooth; it was kind of disappointing to me. But
have faith. The NHL and the NFL will not let you down. And by the way, congratulations on achieving. American Bar Association awarded the White Bronco with the designation of being one of the top 100 blogs, legal blogs. In the United States, and notably the only sports-related legal blog. So congratulations on your achievement. And that's an incredible rookie. That's the best rookie season since Fred Lynn with the Boston Red Sox in 1975. So how are you going to top that?
I don't know. I think I'm just going to retire. Just do it. It's a huge honor. I was very flattered that they would consider me. And as you said, I actually launched a blog on December 3rd of last year. So it's just about 1 year old, so it's been a good ride. And as I tell people frequently, if you have feedback or ideas for me, I'd love to hear them, because I really am looking for what the audience wants to see. So just let me know. Shoot me an email, tweet at me.
More job postings.
I can't make the jobs up. I put everything that's out there up, and kind of let it go from there. But
we have to touch upon domestic violence. We missed the big new wrinkle, at least the non-economic wrinkle of the new CBA.
I think you're right. Yeah, I was going to skip it just because we touched about it last time, but I think it's worth talking about. Obviously, that's a focus of, we've had multiple podcasts on the domestic violence policy in the NFL. I've written significantly about the MLB's domestic violence policy, which, also worth noting, is probably going to be tweaked in the new CBA. We'll see what happens with that. But the NBA, who currently did not have a domestic violence policy, they have a policy that states that there's a baseline suspension for players who commit a violent felony, which domestic violence crimes would fall under that if it's a felony, although the two cases we've seen are players pleading guilty to misdemeanor domestic violence crimes, and that's Darren Collison and then Jeffrey Taylor a few years ago. Taylor had 24 games. Collison, I believe, had 8, although I keep forgetting 8 or 10. But for the first time, we're going to see a memorialized formal domestic violence policy in this new agreement. And I think that's a great step, and I think that the NBA obviously had been thinking about this for a while, but was waiting for this new CBA to properly negotiate the policy with the players and put it in. And I think one of the important quotes that we touched on last time was they're not just focused on the number of games or how the pay is going to happen, but they're really focused on the rehabilitation of the player and how they deal with the victim. And those are the two most important things. And I think it's just another example of the NBA being the most progressive league from a social policies perspective, and really makes them look good. And so I'm really excited to see what that policy says and how it works in practice.
Yeah, big difference between how the NFL, that's a great point, big difference between how the NFL and the NBA will treat domestic violence offenders are, the focus on, treatment and rehabilitation and not solely punishment. The NBA likes its players. The NFL looks to gain victories at the expense of its players, and there's a sizable difference in the mentality in the two leagues' offices. I mean, look at the respect that basketball players show towards Adam Silver. I mean, that's really, if you want to look for the main reason, there are several reasons why a deal with the Basketball Players Association is increasingly inevitable. The players like Adam Silver, they trust him.
That's a great point.
He has tremendous trust. And also, two divisive forces are no longer in the room. David Stern and Jeffrey Kessler. They're both amazing at what they do. You're talking about the best sports antitrust lawyer in the country and probably the most successful sports commissioner in my lifetime. But they are toxic in a room together and add an emotional component and a potentially divisive component that has now been removed. And Adam Silver's insertion in place of David Stern and Roberts taking over largely from the litigation-oriented posture that Jeffrey Kessler would represent is the major difference. But compared to the NFL is going to be facing a significant labor battle in 2020, 2021. The trust isn't there. And if Roger Goodell remains as the NFL commissioner, and I predict that at some point prior to those negotiations, he'll be gone because he will serve. You disagree?
Yeah, I mean he's arguably the David Stern of the NFL, and the fact that he's growing the pie so big. And unless we saw that brief dip in ratings this year, I think the ratings have recovered. There's been some better games on in primetime. The election ended, but unless there's a huge financial change, I just don't see a scenario where he's out. Personally, that's my opinion.
When does his contract expire before 2021?
Well, that's his contract's no longer public, so I don't think we know that. But he, in order for him to be ousted, I think it's like a 2/3 vote by the owners. I think he just has the owners' support because he takes all the bullets for him. I mean, let's face it, the NFL is facing some very major issues moving forward, most notably player safety, and Rodgers arguably done a good job, at least from an owner's perspective, of getting out and just taking all the heat off of them. And so it makes their life easier. They'll pay him a ton of money. I mean, he makes more than any player in the NFL, I think. And the owners are happy with him as far as I can tell. I mean, there's certainly some owners who aren't happy, and I think there's scenarios out there where you can see something happening that would be so bad that would force them to turn on him, but I just don't see that happening at this point.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that his bosses are going to turn on him, because he has, as you correctly pointed out, he's done phenomenally for the ownership financially and in growing the sport. But he's become a flashpoint for the players, and for him for Goodell to be at the head of the bargaining table for what will likely be a protracted nasty fight over a period of many months. I don't know that that's healthy for an amicable resolution, towards a new CBA. And it may not be him being forced out, but maybe different voices being in the room, because the chemistry and the dynamic of Michelle Roberts and Adam Kessler produced a much quicker path to an agreement than the Kessler-Stern dynamic produced, and with the NFL facing a similar negotiation 4 or 5 years out from now, you insert Roger Goodell in any discussion, and he's not going to be trusted by D. Smith. Already there is tremendous disrespect publicly between the two groups. The owners view the players as almost like chattel, to be treated as they see fit, and the players don't like the current setup and they don't trust Goodell. So my prediction, and this is where we disagree, not that he'll be forced out, but I think different voices need to be in the room, because if he's at the head of the table, we could be headed towards another lockout. But fear not, if the NFL doesn't deliver, I think the NHL could also be a potential hotbed of antitrust litigation activity when that deal runs out. So we're in the period in 2016 of labor harmony. But that's largely because the deals that have come up this year have been with sports leagues that have a positive working relationship with their players, and both those leagues have grown and done well, and there's no reason to change or alter the status quo. But hockey and football are going to represent the flip side of that in a few years.
Yeah, I agree. And I point with Goodell, I think it'll almost certainly go to lockout if he is in charge of the table. I agree that he needs new voices in the room, but he's so set in. And my dog is barking. I'm sorry, making another appearance in the podcast. He's so dug in on the issue of maintaining his godlike power over the league, and I don't think that he will ever give up willingly that power to sit over appeals that he gives a discipline out on. And that's just a major issue, and it'll be really an issue to see whether the players will give on that or not, because if they don't, I predict that they will go to lockout, because that's just going to be something that Goodell's not giving on.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we're going to have to wait a few years, but we've got 2 deals down, and we've got to wait probably until 2020, 21. I'm not sure when the NHL deal expires, but those are the 2 that are going to create, I think, the most need for sports legal analysis.
Absolutely. So let's just talk really quick. We're almost out of time, but really quick about how that antitrust challenge would come into play. And we can kind of do it in the context of the NBA deal. So let's say that one or the other side opts out of the deal. The players or the owners could strike. So then we would have a situation where there's no contract, there's a strike. The action would go on, but what could happen is what's called a disclaimer of interest by the NBA players. And that would basically be saying, hey, listen, we're no longer a union, we're disbanding the union. And the reason to do that would be to file an antitrust lawsuit against the league. They couldn't file, as a union, you can't file an antitrust lawsuit against the ownership, but as a group of individuals, you could. And basically their claims would be of the antitrust variety. For example, they would be arguing that things like the draft, things like the salary cap, things like free agency are all violations of antitrust rules because they're creating these artificial restrictions to a free market, right? So if there wasn't a salary cap, the players would be getting so much more money, but instead the owners are artificially capping this amount. So we saw that with the NFL. This exact scenario played out in, I guess, what we would call the first Brady lawsuit, Tom Brady versus the NFL in 2011, which ultimately went up to the United States Appeals Court, and the NFL players ultimately lost. The court said that that the teams could do this. So I mean, what are the chances we see that? What are your thoughts on that scenario?
Well, I mean, one major factor looms over all of this, which is the recent presidential election. Any hope for courtroom victories for the players, I think, was dependent, or at least the chances for success would have been heightened by another 4 years of a Democrat in the White House. 4 years of Clinton, 8 years of Obama would have, I think, tilted the judiciary in a slightly more pro-labor, slant. The Eighth Circuit, which was hostile to Brady's lawsuit in 2011, has become, it still has a conservative, it's one of the most conservative courts in the country, but a little bit less so since 2011. So the environment for successful labor challenge by unions, I think would have been enhanced had Hillary, won the election. Now with Trump, the presumptive president-elect, although they're still recounting ballots in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court will definitely have a conservative orientation, maybe 5-4, 6-3, depending on future retirements. The Eighth Circuit, all the potential circuit courts are going to have 4 more years or 4 years of Trump appointees. So I think the likelihood of success in the courtroom has gone down somewhat, and that flavors, in my view, the prospects of success in the courtroom for the players. And they also have that inconvenient federal law called the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which prohibits federal courts from entering, injunctions during labor disputes. So I think the litigation strategy is going to be compromised by those two factors. But a different litigation strategy needs to be utilized. And at some point, the NFL labor dispute is going to end up in a courtroom. I'm not so sure about the NHL, but the NFL is going to end up in a court somewhere. And the question is, well, what circuit is likely going to be the most favorable? The Eighth Circuit is certainly no longer in play, given the court's ruling in Brady. The Second Circuit, not necessarily a good circuit. So I think we may see a migration towards the California federal court system, like we've seen with some of the recent challenges to the NCAA amateurism rules, the O'Bannon case, the Jenkins case. So I'm looking at the Ninth Circuit and the Northern District of California as being potential battlegrounds for a future NFL lockout litigation scenario. But it's hard to predict at this point what's going to happen. But that's what I'm focusing on. The composition of the federal courts affected by a Trump presidency and the likelihood of choosing a new forum in which to argue these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. I think your point about it's hard to predict what's going to happen is true. What we think is going to happen is that the NBA is going to have a new CBA as of some point next week, but we'll see. Dan, thanks for joining me. You got any new stuff out? I know you wrote an article over the weekend about sports betting in Mississippi potentially.
Yeah, I've been following. Thanks for bringing that up. I've been following the developments across the country with regard to sports betting legalization, and so much attention has been placed on the New Jersey lawsuit, but other states are gearing up, and I'm of the belief that the next state to take the mantle from New Jersey and challenging the federal law will be Mississippi. And, the stars are aligned. There's already talk within, by state officials as to how much money it's going to be bringing in. The casino industry in Mississippi is vast, but it's struggling. So in many ways, the Mississippi situation in 2016 parallels the New Jersey situation in 2010 and 2011. So I think Mississippi is pointing towards a PASPA challenge maybe as soon as next year. So I've written about that, and I think 2017 is going to be an exciting year on the sports betting front because we have a potential Supreme Court case. We have other states maybe entering the fray. So I'm going to continue to write about these things, and it intrudes in almost every show we have, how it impacts the CBAs. So I'm going to try to stay on the front lines with what's happening in sports betting. And other than that, I think the rest of this year I'm just going to try to, stay on top of work, which, somebody's paying me to handle cases. So one of the things I got to do is keep juggling what I'm juggling, and that's the most difficult part about what you and I probably both do, is that we have other ways in which we earn a livelihood. We handle cases and are working lawyers. So I'm following the sports betting, but I'm also trying to keep my head above water in work. and end the year with a job.
There you go.
The same job that I have, and hopefully 2017 will bring more interesting opportunities for me in the practice of law and in the sports law environment with speaking opportunities and writing opportunities. But right now, the only issue that I'm focusing on in sports law, or the main issue, is sports betting, and I'm hopeful that another Brady or Deflategate type issue will emerge for both of us. And the one great thing about sports and law is there's no shortage of big stories and important stories. And I'm waiting for the next one to emerge. Maybe it's Ezekiel Elliott. Maybe he gets suspended next week.
That's one of our predictions, and I think if 2016's taught us anything, I don't think there will be a shortage of stories in 2017. I think 2016 was a kind of a banner year for this industry.
We need to do a year-end review. We should do a year-end review right before the new year. Just kind of like wrap up what took place during the year and just do like one of those year-end review episodes. So the lot that's happened and a lot that's going to continue to occur in sports law. It's one of those dizzying, I wouldn't call it a profession, but it's one of those dizzying areas of the law where from week to week, even day to day, new developments arise, which require analysis and a breakdown of what's going to happen next, and that's what's exciting about it.
Absolutely. One thing I'm working on and looking at right now is the Lane Johnson's legal action against the NFL and the NFLPA. It's kind of a fascinating case, so I should have a story out on the White Bronco in the next day or two, so keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. As always, iTunes ratings and comments are appreciated. That helps us kind of grow our pie, if you will, and we would really appreciate that. And thanks for tuning in. Tell your friends, and until next time, I'll see you, Dan.
Yep. Thanks, Dan. Bye, everyone.